Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today's Tuesday, February 9th, 2022. Tonight's broadcast is one that I'm very excited about. It's talking about couples work, couple relationships. There'll be some references to parenting, but really this is just about coupleship, marriage, or partnership. And so, while Evoke's roots are really in the parent-child relationship, what I love about this particular topic is that all the topics that we talk about illuminate more clearly the work that we need to do when we think about ourselves in relationship to different kinds of relationship to our parents, to our children, and now to our partners. I think it becomes more illuminating. It fills in the picture. So I'm very excited about it. I will tell you that most of these lessons are hard earned for me. Like a lot of my parenting lessons, the value, the gold that I have to offer anybody, if there is any, is born out of my mistakes, our mistakes as a marriage, and it's something even as recently as last night, my wife and I were talking about these things, talking about our relationship and how it's evolving, how we're still learning new things all the time about the very things that I'm going to be teaching this evening. I've mentioned this already, but you're welcome to request the slides. Webinar at evoketherapy.com is the email that you would write to, and I'm happy to provide those to any listener who wants to see them, because there's some really valuable and text-heavy quotes that I'll be reading tonight, and you might want to have them. You can also see them on our YouTube page too, but I want to offer that. So I want to begin with this quote from Captain Corelli's Mandolin. It reads like this: "Love is a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake and then subsides. Love is not breathlessness. It is not excitement. It is not the promulgation of promises of eternal passion. That is just being in love, which any of us can convince ourselves we are. Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away, and that is both an art and an unfortunate accident." Part of what I'm going to be talking about tonight very clearly is our responsibility, the work that we have to do in partnership. Just like raising children, we have married our teachers, and we did not marry them randomly. I know in our angry and our hurt moments, we want to convince ourselves that our partner is utterly insane, and that I don't know how they fooled us, how they were able to successfully bait and switch us into marrying them. But the fact of the matter is, when I see a couple in courtship, I say this all the time in couples therapy. If I see a couple in courtship in the early throes of romantic love, you can see from the beginning the fissures that later become chasms and cracks in the relationship. You can trace it back to that. And so it's our family conditioning, our family programming that brings us to this point. I said to my wife not too long ago, in this context, I said to her late at night when we were having our pillow talk before we went to sleep, I said, she was talking about her own stuff. And one of the things she identifies with is having anxiety. And as she was talking about it, I breathed in the idea that I chose you. I chose I knew you were anxious. I might not have said it diagnostically at the time, but I knew it. It was there, and it wasn't an accident. And I chose you in essence, in a fundamental way, like we all do. I chose you because you were familiar. I chose my partner because I wanted to fix the thing that was unfixable in my childhood, specifically my parents, in this case, my mother. So, as we talk about this tonight, we're not talking about divorce or staying together or staying married or getting married or not getting married. That's not the work. It never is. The work is the same no matter what you do. If you get married to that person, it's the same work. If you don't get married to that person, you still have the same work to do. And if you get divorced from that person, you still have the same work to do. And the choice to marry, to stay together or not, comes out of the work, not the other way around. So tonight really is about responsibility. It's about us taking responsibility for our own happiness. Until we can get curious about our contribution to the dilemmas that we face. How are we playing a part in this? Why did I choose her? What lesson was it asking me, requiring me to learn to marry her? And she would say the same thing about me. After I shared some of this with her, she said, "You're a lot like my mother," which of course I didn't want to hear because I projected onto her mother. I project onto other people the bad parts of myself, but she's right about it. We have some differences, but we have enough in common, and the energy is similar, and the relationship has some similar aspects to it. I love James Hollis, perhaps my favorite prolific self-help writer. And this quote is a great quote. He says, "Of the many projections possible, the most common are those onto the institutions of marriage, parenting, and career. Regarding marriage," he said, "perhaps no other social contract has so much unconscious baggage imposed upon it. Few at the altar are conscious of the enormity of their expectations. No one would speak aloud the immense hopes. Quote, I'm counting on you to make my life meaningful. I'm counting on you to always be there for me. I'm counting on you to read my mind and anticipate all of my needs. I'm counting on you to bind my wounds and fulfill my deficits in life. I'm counting on you to complete me, to make me a whole person, to heal my stricken soul." That might not resonate with you at first glance, but from where I sit, that is in essence the flaw entering into marriage for many people. This fundamental idea that somehow the other person can make us happy, or we can make them happy. And the minute that we've entered into the contract with those expectations, we're doomed for conflict. We're doomed for drama. We're doomed to be faced with the responsibility that my happiness is my responsibility. And in the case of my wife's happiness is her responsibility. And I did not know that, and I was not taught that, and I definitely did not believe that when we got married. And that's again what we're talking about tonight. James Hollis wrote a book called The Eden Project: The Search for the Magical Other. I love this book a lot. It's dense, slow reading. So if you're inclined to read it, to buy it, even somebody with a doctoral degree in the field finds it really dense and slow to read. Take your time. It's a short and thin book, but it kind of illustrates very, very powerfully and in the deepest ways, kind of the tectonic forces in this marriage relationship. Hollis writes, "So to be fascinated by the other is to be possessed by an affected idea. This is what happens in projection. In the most rabid stage of being in love, and rabid is by no means too strong of a word, one is unable to do other than obsess on the other. One is caught in a projective identification with the heart's desires, the boundary between self and others dissolving again as they did for the infant. And accepting our journey obliges one to accept fear and to let go of these chief fantasies." So the expectations going in are in essence what later become the bigger, more visible, and more obvious problems to us. You know, I say to young people, if they're in the right space and able to hear something like this, I'll say, marriage begins when you wake up in the morning and realizing you're fantasizing about how you would murder your partner. That's when the marriage truly begins. When the projections fall away, when you realize that they cannot accomplish all that you've laid at their feet. And there's a rage like the infant feels with these unmet needs. I wrote it like this: romantic love is the discovery of a home that never was. And when the projections fall away, as they must, the work for an enduring love begins. And that's really the maturity of this work. It's the maturity that we ask parents to think about or to look at in parenting, right? You have to get rid of the childish ideas. You know, when the Apostle Paul in the New Testament said, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought of as a child, and when I became an adult, I have to put away childish things." He's referring to this idea that we have to grow up and we have to unlearn the fundamental ideas about important and central institutions like family and parenting and marriage and companionship. And it's scary, and it will be lonely, and you will feel guilt and shame as you step out of that old context and start to work on this thing and build something that you've never seen, never had, never experienced. I once went to a marriage therapist with my business partners who served both as a business consultant and also was a licensed marriage and family therapist. And in the very first session, he said to the four of us, We were all, well, three of us were marriage and family therapists, and one of us was a social worker. Three of us were the PhDs in marriage and family therapy, and then there was another partner that was a social worker. And he asked the four of us, he said, what do you think the responsibility is for an individual in a marriage? And we had thoughts, as you might imagine. We'd been well into our practice at that point. The business was going well, but we were definitely experiencing conflict and in turmoil. If you've been in a business partnership, you know that it is every bit as consuming and powerful of an influence and an impact in your life as marriage. So after we all answered, he said, what if the responsibility that you had in marriage was to enjoy your partner? What if that was your job, to enjoy your spouse? If we take that premise momentarily and accept it as a truth, how are you doing with your responsibility in this partnership or in this metaphorical marriage? And that changed my life right at that moment, right? Like I heard that and I thought, that's right. I'm sitting here with my business partners and with my wife. This was before we separated for 2 years in 2010. And I'm thinking it's their job to make me happy. It's their job to bring my life meaning. And it's my job to make them happy. And we're both as angry as hell. We're all as angry as hell because we've confused the responsibility and we're mad at the other person not doing what we think is their job. So again, this is a different kind of look tonight. This is a different kind of idea into things this evening. I wrote this in the journey, excuse me, in the Audacity to Be You. These phrases that are common during the phases of early courtship or romantic love. You complete me. He is my everything. She is my world. He is my best friend, my lover, and my biggest supporter. She is my better half. While all of the above ideas and statements might sound romantic, they may express in a poetic sense the powerful nature of romantic love. These statements also reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be in a healthy, mature, and intimate adult relationship. The idea of two becoming one in a psychological sense may be the seed of the later problems in marriage. And I talk about this because my wife talked about pre-separation as marriage 1.0 and post-separation as marriage 2.0. And I would make an argument that we feel like I feel like we're moving right now to marriage 3.0, and I don't know where the number sequence ends. But from marriage 1.0 to marriage 2.0, I changed her contact in my phone from my everything, which again, I thought based on the movies and the romance and the that I'd seen in music and in poetry, I thought she was supposed to be my everything. In fact, sometimes when I talk about this individualism, and I'm gonna debunk the idea about individualism a little bit later in the broadcast this evening, but I thought that was the goal. And when I teach this to people, they'll say, "Well, then why even be married?" And when I say to my wife now, and the name that the contact now that she is in my phone, she's called my favorite other. And sometimes when she's feeling a little bit sad or a little bit anxious about something, I'll just say playfully, I want to spend more time with you than anybody in the world. And that doesn't mean that we're happy and joyful and everything's going well all the time, but that's the choice I've made up to this point. You're the other person that I like more than anybody else in the world to spend time with. And she always teases me saying, well, that's a very low bar because sometimes you don't like people. But the point is, this idea from giving over the responsibility for you living your life to somebody else is a fundamental abdication of the responsibility that you have for your journey. And for us, it almost ended up in a tragic divorce. I thought it was. She thought it was at some point. But during that time, not a lot of couples therapy, by the way. I want to be clear about that. Some, for sure, back in those years. But most of it was individual therapy. And most of it was about our personal transformation. And on the other side of that separation, we could come back together in a new and a different way. Because children, I wrote in the Audacity to Be, because children are required to navigate their parents' defenses to survive childhood, they develop in such a way as that they end up relating to people who are the same shape, size, and color of their parents, metaphorically speaking, of course. In other words, we become shaped by a certain kind of compromised person, a human being. And as we grow up, we are inclined to relate to those same kinds of people. The shape of our wounds, our personalities predispose us to fit with others who mirror, in some ways, our original contexts, our parents. The work then is to come to know this by unraveling our childhoods, good, bad, and in between, so that we make friends with ourselves. And if we're lucky, we find a partner who is willing to travel a similar path that is their own. This is the work. Like parenting, the work is about transformation. Marriage, and I'll read you a quote a little bit later from Joseph Campbell on this topic. Marriage is about transformation. Marriage is about expansion. My wife and I have some differences. We see the world in some ways differently. But the one thing we share is a committed practice to we happen to be lucky enough to be able to go to the same therapist who's wonderful, who's willing to see both of us individually. We go to this person weekly, and the quest is, how am I contributing to my well-being? And by the way, to be clear, if you're in a toxic relationship, if the conclusion you arrive at is that to be what I need, to be who I am, won't work out in this relationship, you are allowed to leave. If you have roots that have become entangled together, if you build a life together, it's worth a fight. It's worth work. But ultimately, somebody said to me recently that they had gone to a marriage therapist years ago. And they were wondering how the marriage therapist would be biased. How would they manage their bias about wanting to keep this couple together? And I shared with this friend of mine. I said, that's not my bias coming into it. Staying together is the result either of two people transforming and growing, because in a well-lived life, you're going to be a different person in 10 years. Some of you, and I know some of you, I know many of you, some of you are different people than you were 5 years ago. So how can you marry somebody and then both of you change into different people with different ideas and some different values and ways of looking at things? And the only way you can do it is by expansion, by growing, by transformation, by being open, by continuing to learn. I've said to my young adult children, they don't ask me for advice for marriage, and I don't offer it. In fact, the times that they do ask about partnerships, I'm reluctant to say anything because it's their journey. But the one thing I've said to them is, find a partner who's willing to grow, who's willing to be to die over and over again, to die over and over again, and to be born again over and over again. And there's some hope. There's some hope in that. I posted this a while ago. I've said this for a few years now. When somebody says to me that their ex is a narcissist, my reply is, well, that's interesting. But what's really compelling to me is discovering why you were attracted to someone like that in the first place. So if you happen to be married to an alcoholic, to a narcissist, to a codependent, to an anxious person, to a depressed person, fill in the flavor. Part of the question is, what attracted to you? And it's not that I'm not talking about judging yourself or, oh, I choose toxic people, I choose emotionally unavailable people. That's superficial shaming language. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what needed healing that you thought this other person was going to give you. In my wife's case, it might have been that if she could have garnered the attention of her mother, who had some unhealed narcissistic wounds, she would have felt loved and complete, and she would have been able to create the childhood that she ultimately wanted and needed. And so she married someone with a lot of unhealed narcissistic wounds. And the unconscious thought is, if I can fix him, he's the placeholder for my mother, then I can have the life that I always wanted. And I will feel like a good daughter if I can save him. And we will call that falling in love. There was a slide that I had that I decided to delete because it's too technical. But it's kind of like that. Partner number one, And it works both ways. Partner number one and two have the same issue. It just gets flip-flop with different specifics. Partner number one has an issue. Let's say depression. And partner number two is really good at being around depressed people because they had to spend time around depressed people going up, and they know how it works, and they know how to fit, and they know how to soothe. So partner number one is depressed. Partner number two is a good fixer of depressed people. And partner number two spends time fixing, reassuring, over functioning, over responsible for partner number one. And partner number one feels attended to and loved like never before. The love that they were supposed to get from their parent is now being given to them. And that's what makes it so fantastic, so psychotically enveloping. Partner number two watches how partner number one looks at them with their big eyes. And partner number two says, I'm finally a good son or daughter. I'm finally good. And they call that falling in love. Until eventually, partner number two gets tired. Partner number two has needs that are going unmet because they're compromising or sacrificing them for partner number one. And then there's resentment and fighting. And there's this energy like, you failed me. You changed. You're selfish. But those roots, that plant, the seeds were there in the beginning because the fundamental misconception about relationships was never healed in childhood, as it isn't with any of us really. So it's not about if your ex is a narcissist or a borderline or depressed or anxious or a philanderer or drug addict. That's interesting, but the compelling part is, why are you drawn to that person? What needs to be healed in you still? When we encounter the problems in the other person, like I said, we're looking for a good parent. We're looking for somebody to give us what our parents didn't. We unfortunately do the same thing to our children. We ask them we hope that they will have unconditional love for us because we wanted that from our parents, and because our parents were human parents, they were incapable of being unconditionally loving. So part of what we're looking for is that, they call it in the literature, we're looking to replace the bad mother. But most simply, when Freud said you marry your mother, first of all, it's an energy, right? It's that you're compromised in similar ways and similar themes. And I re-engage you as my partner. I re-engage you as my partner because my soul is asking at the deepest level to repair that problem, to repair that issue. Now, my first attempt for several years is going to try to do exactly the wrong thing, right? Make the depressed person happy in this case, if I'm person number two. So I'll try the wrong thing. I'll try what already hasn't worked with my own mother. But eventually, when I'm tired enough, or when my partner is tired enough, eventually there's a reckoning. There's a bigger ask. There's a bigger call that often goes unanswered unless we have the courage or the accidental wisdom, at least, to stumble into a 12-step meeting like Codependence Anonymous or Families Anonymous or Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is now called, in some places, Adult Children of Toxic Families. We stumble into these places where people are talking about life in a different way, and we set a new course. And like I said, that new course will result in potentially staying together forever till you die, or divorce. But the work is the same. The work is exactly the same. It's also a lot easier to see the wounds of the partner than our own. And it's a lot easier to focus on them. I would much rather fix my wife than fix myself. Fixing myself is painful and terrifying, and I have to confront the dragons of shame and guilt, which I'm sure are going to kill me, destroy me. So instead of that, if I can just shape her up to meet my every need, to be the person that I need for everything, then I don't have to do any work. Similar when I talk that's when I talk about boundaries. We do just about everything to try to change other people and control other people because boundaries are so scary and guilt producing. Hollis says more often the pathology of the parent child relationship is calling the shots, meaning your childhood. Who in their right mind would seek out someone and say, I want to repeat my childhood wounding. I will love you because you are so familiar. And Alice Miller says, when it doesn't work, when we can't get what we need, we oftentimes turn to the child. When that doesn't work, she says, we have children to give us the unconditional love and a sense of being okay. Until we take on the responsibility by finding somebody like a therapist or a mentor or a sponsor who can create a similar kind of experience of secure attachment called earned attachment or repaired attachment. And it takes a long time. It takes years, you guys. Years. In fact, I'll let you know when I'm getting close to the end of the work. When I see the end in sight, I will come on a podcast and let you know I'm almost there. And of course, I'm being facetious. You never arrive. It's a daily practice. Part of the idea of doing the first broadcast I did on couples work many years ago was because everything I did for a lot of years was primarily focused on the parent-child relationship in the context of children being in our wilderness therapy program and their parents, was that we see this very often, that when the child is pulled out of the family system and sent to treatment in this case, or if the child grows up and goes off on their own, how dare they? Some of you are saying, I'm waiting for that. But when the child leaves the context, then the parents are left with themselves. And what they will find is sometimes it's very common for a sibling to say, now I'm getting all the attention and the heat. Because the individuals, again, lacking the ability to take responsibility for their own happiness, look for a scapegoat anywhere. And if there's another child handy, that one becomes the concern. Well, yeah, this first one was doing drugs and was a problem. And so we're getting them help or they're getting better. But now we got this other one who's really anxious, a whole different set of problems that we can focus our anxiety on. We can focus our energy on because, again, it's a lot easier than focusing on us. If there's no child or if the child somehow escapes that predictable pattern, then they'll turn on each other. And what's happening is those were the issues all along. And the child was having to navigate these parents who hadn't grown up yet. Because unless you do this work in a committed way, and I prefer psychotherapy as a way, that's my method, but there's more ways to do it than just that. Like I said, 12-step programs, um, mentors, sponsors, travel, education. There's a lot of ways to do it. Meditation, a lot of ways. But until you do that, until you make that your commitment for your life, you'll have the experience of things being done to you. Like Carl Jung says, your things will happen to you and you will call it fate. But it is the result of your unfinished business, your unfinished work. Now, this particular quote that I'm going to read to you that is in the book, The Audacity to Be You, it lost a little bit of its luster after the Academy Awards last year. But the principle's still true. It's Will Smith. It's a video that someone sent me a few years back that he had made. Just a casual video in his yard, it looks like, on his phone. And this is what he said. He said, whether or not a person is happy is utterly out of your control. He's talking about he and his wife. We came into this false romantic concept that somehow we got married, that we'd become one. And what we realized is that we were two completely separate people on two completely separate individual journeys, and that we were choosing to walk our separate journeys together. But her happiness was her responsibility, and my happiness was my responsibility. We decided that we were going to find our own individual, internal, private, separate joy, and then we were going to present ourselves to the relationship and to each other already happy. Imagine that shift, you guys. Imagine if you took on the responsibility for your own peace and serenity and happiness, and you went out and got it in reliable places like in psychotherapy that's set up to support you 100%, and you came to the marriage or to the parenting relationship already happy. Imagine the kind of shift that would happen in your life and in relationships with that. As a side note, I think this quote actually, I think it played out at the Academy Awards. I shared it with the group last week. I don't like to share it because it's not confirmed. It's not, I can't confirm it, but if you watch the video, and I'm sure everybody listening to the sound of my voice has seen the video of Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, and I'm not making light of this. But if you watch the video, and it's clear, Chris Rock tells the joke and Will Smith chuckles. Jada Pinkett Smith does not chuckle. She's got a very angry, perturbed look on her face. And when Will turns to her and sees her face, everything shifts. And I think what happened was he went back to his old idea. I have to protect her. It's my job to make her happy. Somebody has hurt her feelings. So I'm going to be the knight in shining armor. And he regressed. He was triggered back into the old way of thinking that he himself said they have transcended. And I think if you watch it, you can kind of see that all play out there. Like I said, this is as simple as I can put it. It is not your partner's job to make you happy. That is your job, period. It is not your job to make your partner happy. That is their job, period. And that, if both of you accept, then you get to walk your beautiful, separate, magnificent journeys side by side. You don't have to do it alone if you get so lucky as to find somebody who's walking that same journey. I'm going to talk about intimacy this evening because I think people think that they want it, and it's actually terrifying and painful and disturbing. Intimacy is not the result of it eventually. The afterglow is wonderful. But the work of intimacy is everything bad. It's pain, it's fear, it's guilt, it's shame, it's ego, it's all of it. And really the ingredients in intimacy, the ingredients in a relationship, I've talked about this in our program with having children come into the program. People are saying, well, isn't part of the goal to be close to my child and my child close to me? And my answer is, of course. That's one of the outcomes of this process. But if you were baking a recipe, making a recipe or baking a cake, I would tell you the first two ingredients in a close, intimate relationship are two relatively whole selves instead of two partial selves. And like I mentioned before, parenting challenges are not the causes of marital issues, but they are a force. They are a force that exposes the invisible fissures that are at the foundation of every marriage. I love this quote from the book Meeting in the Shadow, a series of essays by many wonderful artists and analysts and Jungians, and it's called Meeting in the Shadow, and it's edited by Connie Zweig and Abrams. And this is the first essay from Robert Blythe in chapter 1, and he says this. But one day we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of us. He compares an individual child growing up as a ball of light. But one day we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of the ball. To keep our parents' love, we put those parts in a bag. Next, teachers and peers have their say, telling us what is unacceptable. Blythe describes this process using the imagery of a bag that we drag behind us. We put all of those parts of ourselves in the bag to keep from being alone and rejected and left. In middle school, high school, and college, the process accelerates. And our stuffing the bag with these parts that people are telling us are unacceptable, that disturb people, that worry people, that trigger people, we put them in this bag. And the bag gets larger and larger. Then, Blythe says, out of a round globe of energy, the 22-year-old ends up with a slice. We'll imagine a man who has a thin slice left, and we'll imagine that he meets a woman. Let's say that they are both 24. She has a thin, elegant slice left. They join each other in a ceremony, and this union of these two slices is called a marriage. Even together, the two slices don't make up one whole person. While many imagine the fusion of two into one romantically, it can also be a condition of psychosis, a severe distortion of reality. The phrase crazy about you may be an accurate depiction of the early stages of romantic love, but as the relationship grows, fissures are exposed And later, with time and pressure, they become chasms. If we look close enough, like I've said, we inevitably discover that the early experience of love was flawed in its foundation. So the work is, that's why I say so much, couples therapy is more advanced. Maybe that's why my wife and I don't go to couples therapy anymore, because we're too early in the process, and we realize that. So we go to individual therapy. But again, individual therapy is really about my relationship with myself. And all the relationships in our lives are a reflection of the relationship we have with ourselves. That is a truth that is, in my experience, is universally true. The relationship that we have with ourselves, its quality is the predictor or the pattern of all the other relationships. So I go to therapy by myself every week. And part of that is about being a better, larger father, a better, larger husband, a better, larger friend and employee and boss and colleague and neighbor and citizen. I love this quote because sometimes I talk about things like this and it sounds a little bit crazy, but it's this beautiful thing that I saw just this weekend. Laura Sims, who's a storyteller, writer, and teacher, said this: when Francis Harwood, anthropologist, asked the Sioux elder why people tell stories, he answered, in order to become human beings. She then asked, aren't we human beings already? He smiled, not everybody makes it. See, people who do, I'm not talking about CBT and DBT and ACT and EMDR. All of those are fine tools, right? In a therapist's tool belt, tool chest, right? Those are fine. All of those are great. They give us perspective. But the fundamental idea in psychology is about transformation. And it's the transformation from the idea that we were supposed to be good because we've been told to be afraid of being bad. But the problem is that the things that we were told to be afraid of are not bad. The things that we were told to fear are in many ways where our greatest wisdom and our power is. And so we shift the project from being good children, good adults, good partners, good friends, to being whole. Being, as the Sioux elder describes, being a human being. And the Sioux elder is absolutely right. Most people don't make it. He says not everyone makes it. But in my experience, this work is the road less traveled. James Hollis says in the middle passage, the paradox of individuation is that we best serve intimate relationships by becoming sufficiently developed in ourselves that we do not need to feed off of others. Individuation, people think of it as this hyper individualism. It's not that. It's not that. It's simply taking responsibility. It's like the serenity pair, understanding what you can and can't control and focusing on what you can. It's being responsible for your own happiness. It's ironically, individuation is taking responsibility to find connections and community, to find your tribe, to find your life partner. So again, even the word individuation, I've heard people talk about it, criticize as hyper individualism. You can hear the lie that people have been told as children. My wife said it this way. I have myself as a quote, but I put her name in parentheses because she's the one who really said it. But she told me she didn't need credit, but I like giving it to her. She said, for deeper connections, we don't constantly come to our relationships hungry. We come with full bellies, take responsibility for our own happiness, and learn to find multiple sources of support. When we do these things, we are more capable of love and are able to attend to the needs of others rather than constantly asking the other to take care of us. And Hollis writes, the capacity for growth depends on one's ability to internalize and take personal responsibility. If we forever see our life as a problem caused by others, a problem to be solved, then no change will occur. So it's about working on yourself. It's about understanding that you came to the marriage unfinished, with some unfinished business. And that unfinished business will get exposed in the stress and the pressures and the proximity of a marriage. When I was a little kid, I remember very young, had to be pre third grade because it was in the first home that I grew up. I can remember that I had best friends on the street. And sometimes we would spend the night at each other's house, one or the other. And I realized inevitably I'm going to get frustrated and we're going to get in a fight. Both of us realized it. You spend enough time together. Family relationships are the measure, in a sense, of our mental health. When children in the wilderness say to me, well, I get along with everybody but my parents, but my family, my response is, well, that just means you're not completely insane. That just means you're normal. Right? If you can't get along with friends and strangers, that's more serious. Ram Dass said it when he said, if you think you're enlightened, spend time with your family. The family relationship, the proximity, the time, the commitment, the mutual obligations and responsibilities that we share, expose who we are, expose where there's still growth. Remember this. One of my favorite new sayings, the trigger that you feel with your child or with your partner, the trigger is not in the way. The trigger is the way to enlightenment, to greater peace and happiness. So there's a I think it's part of it's like being a second born. I'm a second born, and second borns are typically want to make the implicit explicit. They want to make the covert overt. All the unspoken energies, they want to highlight them and bring them to consciousness. The firstborns typically, and this is not universally true, but this is when they talk about birth orders and they talk about these patterns. The firstborns tend to identify with the most dominant values in the family, or the values of the most dominant and powerful parent. But the secondborn comes along and oftentimes is the rebel. And maybe it's the rebel in me. But most of what I've learned is counterintuitive, counter to what the broader culture teaches. Differentiation, similar to individuation and intimacy. It's kind of both individuation and intimacy. It's a balance of self and connection. And people ask me all the time, should I get divorced? Should I send my child away? Am I being a doormat? Am I being too rigid, too demanding? Am I not being demanding enough? Right? Those are the kinds of questions. And my answer to those questions is, you're right. You're asking the right questions. And the answer to that question is you. The answer to that question is, who are you? When I wrote in the beginning of the journey of the heroic parent, the first chapter, might even be the preface, I can't remember. I wrote the story about going to my own first intensive during that separation time. And the question was, do I stay married? Do I get divorced? That's what I thought I was going to answer. But I walked away realizing that's not the right question. The right question is, what's my project? And for me, the project was to tell the truth. Because I'm a liar. I'm a pleaser. I want to avoid conflict. I want to make you happy. I want to take care of your needs, but I end up with resentments, unmet needs. And I leak them, I act them out sideways. So I left there, even from the very first discussion I had with my wife, who called me the day after I'd graduated. I had a business trip. The day after I'd finished, I was on a business trip. I realized my job is to tell the truth about how I feel, what I like, what I want, what I don't want, what I value and what I don't. And I found that if I could tell the truth and the other person was okay enough with the truth, then we would call that a marriage. And what I found was I said at the time I'd fallen out of love with my wife. But as my wife did her own separate work, and I'll talk about kind of the other side of that equation of the truth telling, as my wife did her own separate work, I fell back in love with her more than I ever had been in love with her during marriage 1.0. Because I could be me. I could live my own vivid, full life. It's not always easy. It's not always easy to live with somebody. But that's part of what she works at. She works at finding that balance of figuring out how to take care of herself and support her crazy husband. Intimacy cannot be achieved to the extent that a self is not present. That's why the work is the foundational work is individual work. And again, I even read a quote today by somebody that I admire in Eastern philosophy. And they use the word detachment or attachment differently than psychologists. It's a different word. But in psychology, healthy detachment, which is what people in recovery talk about, this kind of love that comes with a kind of a freedom to it, a non-control to it, an attunement for the other, a recognition and a support of other and otherness. Healthy detachment is synonymous with healthy connection. But because we had no model for it, because our parents didn't understand boundaries, and power and control and intimacy and selfhood, we have distorted ideas about what love and relationship and boundaries looks like. Systems that support differentiation allow for differences and provide a sense of belonging. I read this the other night. I'm going to read it again. I love it. It's from James Hollis. In fact, I think I have it. I won't read it right now. I'll get to it in just a minute. Here it is. Hollis said, the ultimate test of the family is not whether it provides safety and predictability, but whether or to what degree each person can leave it freely and return freely as a larger person. True connection has to have as much space in it and freedom in it, and non-attachment in the Buddhist sense, attachment in the psychological sense, but non-attachment in the Buddhist sense, right? Freedom. Or it's not love. It's obligation. It's should, right? It's why I say divorce has to be an option. It has to be an option. Because if it's not an option, you're not choosing to stay married because there's no choice. For it to be love, to truly love your partner, you have to be willing to leave your partner. And that the act of staying is love embodied. But if you can't leave, if you're dependent, if I can't live without you, if I rely on you for my very functioning, right? It's not a choice. It's not love. Loving is not needing, as I will explain later. Loving is the choice that I can leave, but I choose not to. Or as Khalil Gibran says, let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of the heavens dance between you. Love one another, but make not a bond of love. Let it rather be a moving sea between the shores of your soul. And he says it better than I do. Again, this idea of self. Delmore Schwartz, as quoted in the Eden Project, said, who among us can ever know ourselves well enough to be capable of agape, an expression of what we might oxymoronically call disinterested love? That is, love wholly invested in the well-being of the other, without the shadow of self-interest cruising beneath the surface like a shark. When one thinks that selflessness is the goal, then it works behind your back, right? The shadow lurks like a shark beneath the surface. We have to own our stuff, our baggage, and we all have it. And that's really all. My wife and I have been talking about this. All I want is just each of us to own our own separate baggage, our own journey. And yes, I'm going to be triggered by her. I do get triggered by her. And yes, she will be triggered by me. But the triggers are ours individually, respectively. And the fantasy that I can become a saint or she can become a saint is part of the problem. The great thing about psychology is that when we do our work, we change the frame from turning the other person into something bad to seeing the other person as just simply a human being. As we become human, we see other people as humans. I wrote this a few weeks back. My thoughts on looking for a partner or friend: look for someone willing to listen, someone willing to be wrong, someone willing to be the bad one, admit a mistake, or in other words, somebody that's human. And I wanted to put this slide up here. It's a little bit off track, but if you get accused of being defensive, I want you to hear this because it's important. Defensiveness, it doesn't feel like defensiveness to the one that's exhibiting it. Defensiveness, when you're the person defending, it feels like, quote, they don't understand me. They don't see the whole picture. So the task is to find and understand the other. The task is to understand each other, to fall in love, as my therapist teaches, to fall in love with each other's dilemma. And I think about that on a daily basis. I mentioned this earlier. So often, Hollis says the idea of individuation has been confused with self-indulgence or mere individualism. But what individuation more often asks of us is a surrender to the ego's agenda. In other words, letting go of the idea of being good. Surrender of the ego's agenda of security and emotional reinforcement in favor of humbling service to the soul's intent. He's just saying poetically to become a person, to become a self, to find and follow your deepest truths. That's what individuation is. It's not hyper-individualism. People that are individuated in the sense that Hollis and I are talking about it are more compassionate and more loving. The Dalai Lama has an advanced form of individuation. It doesn't lead to, as we've been told, to fear. It doesn't lead to selfishness. This is the quote I referred to other. Maybe one of my top favorite 2 or 3 quotes about marriage. Joseph Campbell said, I think one of the problems in marriage is that people don't realize what it is. They think it's a lifelong love affair, and it isn't. Marriage has nothing to do with being happy. It has to do with being transformed. And when the transformation is realized, it is a magnificent experience. But you have to submit. You have to yield. You have to give. You can't just dictate. And Hollis adds on his commentary, after quoting Joseph Campbell, says, transformation is about enlargement, and enlargement generally comes from suffering. You will break and bleed. Stretching is painful. Growing is painful. Transformation is terrifying, as I've said. In marriage, I believe that the term soulmate is something that is earned through the daily, lifelong work of the 2 people in it. We do our work, and this is how we say to each other, I love you. So intimacy. I'm going to go over tonight, so this is going to be probably about an hour and 10 minutes or so long. In intimacy, it's not always harmonious. It's first about being honest. 2 things are required for intimacy: somebody telling the truth and somebody listening. While telling the truth is scary because we expect to have it go the way it's gone before in our childhood and later on in our intimate relationships, it takes courage. It's terrifying. As a person who struggles to please people and at times my impulse is constantly leaning toward that instead of telling the truth. It's terrifying. But the second requirement in intimacy is listening. And that by far, in my experience, is the harder of the 2 tasks for most people. I've said this many times. There's a lot of press, right? A lot of ink about being vulnerable, telling the truth, being courageous and telling people what you need, what you want. But listening to somebody, especially an intimate partner, when they're angry, when they're sad, when they're scared, when they're upset with us, that takes real capacity. And that takes a precondition that you're going to take care of your needs outside of this conversation. To listen, you have to set aside your needs during that conversation for a temporary time. And there's no hack or shortcut. Yes, I can teach you listening skills, but the capacity to do it in in an authentic, consistent way is built upon your going out there, like I was talking about earlier after the Will Smith quote, going out there and making it a practice of taking care of yourself. It doesn't feel good. If your partner doesn't talk to you, I just say, I wonder why. If your partner doesn't share enough, maybe ask yourself, I wonder if I'm contributing to a lack of safety. And vice versa. If you're the one that has a difficult time saying difficult things, you have some things to face yourself to tell the truth. You have to be willing to let go of the connection temporarily and the possibility of it exploding or going badly. It doesn't feel good. But like Campbell says, after the transformation, it's magnificent. The result is magnificent. Hollis writes, honoring the other and allowing for differences. It is to open the door to feeling self and other to be who each other is meant to be. It is to open both to the possibility of something called love. We have to own our own fear and anxiety, not blaming our partner for what they said or how they said it. And furthermore, we have to make it a practice. We have to learn to feel, talk about, identify our feelings, know that feelings and emotions are the fueling our behaviors. And a lot of them are very old and very young. And be present with ourselves. We have to fight the instinct to succumb to our fear and to try to control things. Star Wars, that's what that's about. The Matrix, actually virtually every movie and every story is about this. The terrifying nature of romance and intimacy because it is risking everything. Rejection, shame, and an unspeakable dread of being alone. Not just physically alone, but alone in the universe. I wanted a couple of more practical things. It is critical that we learn to distinguish between loving and needing. To love and to need. Many think of needing somebody as a deeper and higher form of love, but let me be clear. Loving is a giving thing. To love is giving. And it's I could explain it in the phrase, how can I help you? How can I support you? I have extra energy to give. While needing is a taking thing. Can you do this for me? The two neither one of them is bad. Neither one of them is good. We will love people and we will need people, and we will love and need the same person. But when we confuse the two, that's when it becomes problematic. When I come into a discussion, if I walk into my wife's room where she's at, and I think I'm there to see how she's doing, but I'm really asking her to take care of me, that's not going to work. So if I go in there and I have the crazy idea to say, hey, how are you? I've got to have my belly full. Versus saying, hey, I need something from you. Are you willing to listen to me? I have some uncomfortable things to say. I'm mad about our discussion earlier, or I'm hurt about what you said. Do you have the capacity for me? But because we have so much shame of not being adequate, we have so much fear about saying, I need. We can't speak these things. And we end up in the same fights, virtually the same script and tapes over and over again because we're not addressing. It's okay to love and to need someone, but we must be able to see the difference between the two. If we do not see it and acknowledge it, a few things will occur. There'll be feelings of resentment and abandonment. And of course, we'll project our inadequacies onto the other. I love this quote. This is probably my all-time favorite quote. I have it in the second book. In fact, I have a whole chapter in The Audacity to Be You on this quote from Gandhi that reads this way. A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation, our own journey. And this heroism may properly be called love. I can do nothing for you but work on myself. I saw a quote just the other day, 2 days ago, that said, what if we define love as the ability to regulate our own nervous system? Or as Ram Dass said, the only thing I can do for you is work on myself. The only thing you can do for me is work on yourself. And ultimately, for marriage to be successful, I believe you have to fall in love with your partner's dilemma. It doesn't mean you have to solve it, fix it. You have to tolerate the abuse that might come from it or the mistreatment. You can have boundaries, but a practice of compassion because of your work, because you see your dilemma. And the more work that you do, the more you'll see yourself and others. The less work that you've done, the more you'll see other as in a sense, as not me, something entirely foreign to my nature. We have to fall in love with our partner's dilemma over and over again. I love this quote from an article in the New York Times. Compatibility is an achievement of love. It must not be its precondition. The name of the article is Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person. Of course, tongue in cheek, because marrying the wrong person is your soul's attempt to solve and work on the unfinished business. Falling in love can be profound if we can be ourselves in a relationship, and that person that we are is tolerated and even welcomed and celebrated. Like I said earlier, divorce has to be an option or else it's not a choice. And you really have two projects. I was saying this earlier. Telling the truth and being who you are. Both of you have that job, but also holding the other with love and kindness, which takes capacity and work. I wrote this just 2 days ago. Deep listening, attunement, some call it, I call it, therapists call it containing. Deep listening and attunement requires you to temporarily set aside your needs. Therefore, your ability to deeply listen and attune to another person rests on a practice of attending to your trauma and your needs in another place at another time. That's why couples therapy and family therapy doesn't feel great a lot of the time. At best, in couples therapy, at best, 50% of it's going to be for your needs. 50% of it is not going to be for your needs. And you'll feel that. Believe me. If you want to listen, I wrote, develop a practice of self-care, attending to your trauma and needs. But this practice, here's the rub, and here's where everything kind of comes together. This practice of attending to your needs and self-care will likely trigger guilt and shame in you. There'll be a voice in your head saying you're selfish, you're letting people down, you're dropping balls, you're not being there for people. Thus, we see the link between working on guilt and shame so we can be there in meaningful ways for those that we love. Healing your guilt and shame is primary in the work of being in an intimate relationship, being a loving, lifelong, soulmate kind of relationship. Marriage is hard and divorce is hard. Like I said, either way, you have the same work to do. A few years ago when I said to my therapist, I'm not thinking of divorce, but sometimes I fantasize that it might be easier. And without me even getting to the next sentence, my therapist said it would be different. And this is what she meant. She said, even if you change jobs, it's like if you change jobs from being a therapist to going back to school and becoming an engineer, it would be different. And immediately I felt free. And I realized this is the choice I want to make, is to stay married to this woman and to work on this stuff that is painful and difficult and scary and shame producing and guilt producing and angering and all those things. The two projects are telling the truth and being who you are, holding the other with love and kindness, like I said. And resisting the urge to make the other person the bad object, the bad one, the one to blame. In considering divorce, if one looks close enough, one can see how the problems were there in the beginning, like I mentioned. Growing up will expose the emotional immaturity of the other and reveal the fractures that were present in the beginning. Getting married will expose you. So here are the take-homes. You have to understand your own craziness. You have to understand your own mental illness, your own pathology, your own darkness. And the more you do that, the more you'll see. There was a quote that I shared today on social media that I'll read to you from my phone. Because I just thought it was so powerful by the monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away just a couple years ago, and he wrote this. He said, "Continue practicing." He's talking about meditation, but therapy, he also calls therapy a kind of meditation. He says, "Continue practicing until you see yourself in the most cruel and inhumane political leader, in the most devastatingly tortured prisoner, in the wealthiest man, and in the child starving, all skin and bones. Practice your practice, do your work," in my words. "Practice until you recognize your presence in everyone else, on the bus, on the subway, in the concentration camp, working in the fields, in a leaf, in a caterpillar, in a dewdrop, in a ray of sunshine. Meditate until you see yourself in a speck of dust and the most distant galaxy." That's what psychologists, philosophers talk about when they say it's all in here. The stories that we show where the hero or the heroine goes into the cave, the dark forest, the night, the deep ocean, 20,000 leagues under the sea, the jungles in Africa. Those are metaphors for looking at yourself, for facing what you can't see, what you don't know, for understanding your dreams and your nightmares. The trigger is the way. The trigger is not in the way. Western ideas, philosophies, religions have set us at war against ourselves, against the world, against our bodies, against each other. Eastern philosophies avoid this dualism by saying they're the same thing. Your pain is your love uncovered, as Gibran puts it. Your trigger is your lesson. Your enemy is your teacher. Your child who's struggling is your teacher. Your spouse is your teacher. I used to say to kids in a thought experiment, I said, imagine if you don't believe in a God, just imagine for a moment that there's a God, there's a design. Everybody in your life has been put here by that person for you. Now, what are you going to learn from them? Sometimes you have to learn to leave. That's the lesson. I have to leave. I can't be myself. I can't find peace within this relationship. I can't find meaning. I can't find my soul's music. That can be the terrifying nature of this, is that can be the answer that you eventually find. But whatever you find, once you've found your soul, you're never alone again. Once you connect to your soul, in a sense, the way that they talk about it is you've found God. If you're looking for a higher power, if you've lost or don't have a connection to a higher power, my idea is that's because you've been disconnected from your soul. When you find the music of your soul, when you find your unique, special, weird, quirky gifts, you'll know God. You'll feel the rapture of being alive, as Joseph Campbell calls it. We have to make a shift from being a good person to being a whole person. Most of our fights with our partners are around who's good and who's bad, and we ask our partner to carry around our ego. We ask our children to carry around our ego. The ego has to die, in a sense. An ego death is what they call it in Jungian circles. I have to make friends or kill the dragon of should and should not, or some people say make friends with the dragon of should and should not. Love must mature. If divorce is the option, it need not be out of anger or resentment because the other person's a monster or a narcissist or borderline or a cheater or an alcoholic or an addict. It's because sadly, you can't live with that anymore, whatever that is. And you have the courage to look at the grief and the loss and to know that the work is the same. You've solved nothing by getting divorced. You've solved nothing by staying married. The solution is finding yourself. And those other decisions are merely outcomes of that exercise, that journey. Understanding what your project is, not their project, your project. What's your project? Learning to fall in love over and over again with the other person's dilemma, which comes oftentimes right on the heels of you discovering your dilemma and realizing it will be the work of your lifetime. Know that the talker, the one talking, tends to be taking. And the listener tends to be giving. So if you want your partner to talk, ask yourself if you're a safe person to talk to, or if you get triggered, or correct them, or talk over them, or explain how they just don't get they just don't get you. Watch if your ego gets in the way of listening. You've got to set that aside, at least temporarily, and take care of that in another place and time. Got to know the difference between giving and taking. They're not the same. And it's hard for us to admit that we need things and that we take. Be responsible for yourself and take care of yourself. Don't abdicate that to somebody else. And then be responsible for your marriage. And like I said, love and marriage is when you can leave. The simplest way I've seen somebody say it is the precondition for deep intimacy and love is the ability to be alone. All right, folks, don't time for questions. Get your QR code, your camera's ready if you want to take any pictures of these QR codes. Like I said before, you can ask for the copies of these slides by emailing webinar@evoketherapy.com, because I know there were a lot of great quotes on this. And you can also, if you're watching live or on YouTube, you can open up your camera and aim it toward the QR code, and there'll be a link that'll pop up with the respective webpage. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. I narrated the second one. Our new programming, these are brand new programs. On February 24th, I think there's 1 or 2 spots left. I'm going to be hosting a conscious parenting workshop, my third iteration of this. That'll be 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Mountain Time with an hour for lunch. So you can go to our website there. Also, I'm teaching a masterclass on attachment-based therapy. That's basically my philosophy, attachment-based therapy. May 26th from 9:30 to 4:30. It's for therapists and people that work in therapeutic settings. If you want to go to it and you're a parent or a person and you're not necessarily a therapist, that's fine. But just know I won't spend a lot of time teaching how to make applications more broadly. There'll be, of course, some examples, but you'll have to generalize and extrapolate yourself from the concepts that I talk about therapeutically. And on June 23rd through 25th, I'm going to be hosting a Finding You weekend in a beautiful, beautiful house that we've stayed in before. Wonderful, large property in the UK outside of London, about an hour and a half. Finding You weekend in the UK. Contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for any comments, questions. If you want to do a deep dive into the stuff, you want to do the work that I'm talking about, Finding You is the place. The next offering is February 22nd. We have one a month in person, also online. If you want to do it online, it's a third of the cost and it's over a weekend, so you're not missing work. So if resources are limited, which they are for a lot of us a lot of the time, an online option is a great option to get your work done. March 3rd through 5th is the next offering. We also have custom Finding Connection for couples intensives and Finding Family for families. Intensives@evoketherapy.com is the place to email for questions. We have one support group each week for current and alumni families of our Wilderness program. February 16th is our next offering at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting. February 28th at 6:30 p.m. is the next offering for our alumni only. And then our intensives programs, we host once a month a support group, a check-in for our alumni of our intensives program. February 14th at 6 p.m. is the next offering. Contact Sarah D, SARAD, at evoketherapy.com for more information, or visit us on our family involvement page on our website, or use the QR code. Coaching services. I'll read a few of the things that coaching can be good for. Couples and intimacy issues, codependency-related issues, post-intensive support and integration, navigating challenges related to the stage of life, wraparound services in helping parents receive children and adults after treatment, So contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. This is for parents, couples, families, or individuals. These are therapists and coaches who have been trained in the attachment-based model. I came up with this slide. This is our current coaching staff right now. So there's a lot of folks to choose from, and we can help match you with somebody who would be a good coach. You can do that online, virtually, all over the world. We have pursuits and adventure trips for families and for young adults. Think sober fun or therapy light. 3 to 30-day programs, custom designed for you and your family. Could be Southern Utah, where our program is our wellness program is hosted, or anywhere in the world. We've done them in Nepal, Central America, the Caribbean, British Columbia, all over the world. So intensives@evoketherapy.com if you're interested in a pursuits trip. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. So any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org and NAMI.org, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. All of these places have online resources and chapters in your local community for free classes and resources. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just go to your favorite podcast app and search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and you can listen to us there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and you can watch the rebroadcast version of these with the slides and my face and all. You can follow Evoke Therapy Programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then we have a blog on our website that has new content, wonderfully curated, written by our staff and therapists. If you want to get back for people that can't afford treatment, can't afford therapy, our 3 charitable partners includes ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can go there, you can give back, you can even earmark your donation for somebody to go to an intensive or for somebody to go to a wellness therapy program. My upcoming broadcast will be next week, Wednesday, February 15th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be reviewing the book, The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. It's been recommended to me by one of our staff, so I look forward to doing that. All right, folks, I hope this was a helpful point of contact for you, for and in behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you. Thank you for showing up to watch or to listen and for being willing to do your work, which I think is the greatest of all love languages, is the willingness to do your work. Have a great evening. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.